up to 70% of published studies are not reproducible in the life sciences.
Really?
Yeah. Reproducibility in the life sciences is a major problem, and automation promises a solution. So it's not about making current science cheaper, it's about enabling a completely different type of science, a more reproducible science. We heard one horror story in Vancouver where a PI could not reproduce an experiment for like 3 years. Turns out it was because the floors were waxed when it was done, and the floors were not waxed when they tried to reproduce it. So it's really, really crazy stuff.
What exactly is the solution that you're building, and why is it that it's going to change how scientists are going to work?
Sure. So
this sounds like a really good solution, right? Like if you materialize, like if you have like a co-pilot for scientists. What were sort of the market insights that led you to this, and how do you know that this is possible?
it was really a technical unblock.
This sounds like you're going to face a lot of what the autonomous driving research for the past 10 to 15 years face, which is, the reason why autonomous cars is only commercializing today is because there's so many, edge cases and corner cases, a lot of scenarios that is hard to predict, right? I feel like you guys are going to face the same problem as well. Like, how do you see that?
Yeah, you're correct.
So today we have two very special guests, Theo and Christian, founder of Testuwan. And you guys just came up with stealth, a $2.7 million raise led by 2048. Congratulations. That's a big fit.
That's a big fit. Thank you, Jason.
And thanks for coming to the pod.
Yeah, thanks for having us on this cold and rainy day.
Yeah, rainy day in San Francisco.
I'm very excited to be here.
Thank you. No, honor for me to have you guys. Tell me, what is Testuwan? What are you guys building?
Sure. So at Testuwan, Theo and I are developing alongside a small team of engineers what we consider AI scientists. These are systems that combine lab robotics with agentic software. So mixing both of these, you have a lab robot with physical agency, but also the capacity to think like a human scientist and communicate like a human scientist. So if you tell it, hey, I want you to experiment in this way, it would be able to do it as if you were telling your colleague down the bench or a research assistant this experiment. It's a really recent field. There were some publications on AI science late last year, and those are the foundations that we build on. But it is a very exciting field, and we think that it has the possibility to augment the way that we utilize scientific labor.
Very interesting. So it sounds like a lab robot that is going to be augmenting scientists to do experiments.
Yeah, a thinking lab robot.
A thinking lab robot. Tell me more. And how has scientists been working in lab today? And give me a history of that.
Sure. Of course, there's a variety of different disciplines and a variety of different positions within each discipline. But we're focused on the life sciences, specifically bioengineering. And today, there are far too many people, whether these are just staff scientists or research assistants or even graduate students, that perform their wet lab experimentation at the bench. So when we say wet lab experimentation, we mean sitting in a lab with chemicals and a coat on, pipettes, stuff like that, right? So when a scientist wants to execute an experiment, they're either doing it themselves or telling an RA to do it most of the time. While automation tools do exist today, they're only for doing the same thing over and over, like in a factory. So they're not really good for doing what a human can do, which is high variety tasking. Do this experiment. Now do this one a little bit differently. It's good for doing the same thing over and over and over again. This is like if you're a COVID lab and you're processing a whole bunch of samples. That's what it's good at today. So we see this as augmenting scientific labor, because right now, a lot of scientists have to be on the bench physically executing experiments. But if they weren't, it would give them more time to maybe read up on literature or come up with new ideas or analyze data that's come out of past experiments to gather insights and think of new things to do, right? So it shifts them away from the bench and more towards what their PIs or people above them do.
So you mentioned earlier, like these scientists, they work with these lab robots that already exist in the market, right? And tell me more about what is the workflow today? Like, how does this scientist work with those robots today?
That's a great question. So to understand how impactful AI scientists are and these recent publications in our work, you have to first understand what we call classical automation.
Classical automation.
Yeah. Automation existed for a long time, like 30 years, since the 90s. The bread and butter robot in lab automation is called a liquid handler. This robot may even be a misnomer. It looks like a 3D printer. It's this big gantry with a pipette on it, and the pipette moves on the gantry to move liquids around, right?
Yep.
So these robots, usually they require a very skilled engineer called an automation engineer that interfaces between the scientist and the robot. So the scientist doesn't know how to program the robot.
Yep.
They have to convert their experimental intent into code that the robot will execute to perform the experiment. And this middleman helps them do it. But this process of converting scientific intent into executable code is very, very tedious. It imposes a high activation energy to use these tools, right?
Yep.
So-
So you need to hire someone in-house.
Yeah, you got to hire somebody,
Yeah.
or sometimes you get a consultant or you contract this out. But whatever you do, it's a real pain in the ass
Yep.
to set these robots up to do something, right? So it's only worth setting them up to do something that's going to happen a lot of times at low differentiation. These are high throughput, low variety tasks. Going back to the example, like at your operating a COVID lab, it's doing the same exact PCR every single time, right? So
Yep.
these are really good as like factory machines, but they're not really good as co-scientists or like AI lab assistants. You can't go and say, hey, do this experiment for me really quick. Expect it to spit something out. Yeah, no, you need to call somebody up that he's going to say, I could be down there in 2 weeks. It's going to take me 2 months to set up the experiment, and then you can run it. By the way, how many of this experiment are you going to run? You're going to say 100, and he's going to hang up the phone. So these tools exist, but the high activation energy imposed by translating scientific into executable code limits them to just pretty much manufacturing tasks. So our interest is in automating this conversion of scientific intent to executable code with an AI agent instead of an automation engineer. That way, there's a lot more tasking that's available. The activation energy drops, and then you can communicate with these tools as if they were other scientists instead of being this middleman. So you could say, hey, I need to do this qPCR plate prep. Here is the plate in an Excel file. Go prep it for me. I need to do this RNA extraction. I need to do this meat prep. I need to go do whatever. Here is the manual. Go do it for me. And the robot goes and does that. Oh, it messed up. Maybe add 30 minutes to the incubation time. Robot understands, iterates, and does that, just like a human scientist would. Right now, this is impossible for these tools. You'd have to call back up that engineer, and you'd have to come and configure the lab robot to make that translation. So that's what we're trying to automate to unlock new tasking and usage for these live robots.
Super interesting. So in today's world, I'm not a scientist. I've never worked in a lab. So like, I still kind of imagine. So imagine I'm a scientist, right? And I'm working on a new experiment, right? And I want the lab robot to work on some task for me. In today's world, I have to call a technician or an operator or hire somebody in-house, right, to work on that robot to like set it up for me in order for me to run those automations.
That's correct.
And I have to do that every single time.
Yes, every time. Like you are going to change slightly your protocol, you're going to have to call this automation engineer again. And that's what makes like irrelevant for R&D. Like when you're doing a high throughput test, it's fine because this engineer is going to come and is going to like do his work for like several weeks, sometimes up to months, like 2 months to set up like the pipeline. And once it's done, if you run it like 20,000 times, it was worth it, like spending these 2 months programming the robot.
2 months to program the robot.
Yes. Wait, so I know that was my reaction first, like a year ago.
Wait, okay. So if I want to have an experiment, I need to call somebody up or hire somebody in-house and schedule a time and tell them exactly what to program.
That's correct.
And it's going to go back and forth. You can't just tell them they're going to spit something out. They're going to ask a whole bunch of clarifying questions with feedback loops. They say, are you sure you want it like this? Are you missing a step? Is there something you didn't tell us? These a lot of times in a lab, as silly as it sounds, because reproducibility is very important, we abstract a lot of the necessary steps. They're implicit. So
Yeah.
one of the things that we like to think of, like a thought experiment, is like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
Yeah, as we were like talking briefly before we started the cameras, like this example is like the perfect one to explain how complicated it is for a lab automation engineer and a scientist to communicate and like program the robot. There's like a very like typical example in classes of computer science and programming. The professor will ask you, how do you make a peanut butter jelly sandwich? Can you make a list of instructions? And you're gonna make a list of instructions. You can say, okay, take the bread, put your knife like in the jam, spread it on the bread, and then like put the bread close the sandwich. And inevitably, he's gonna find a way to like make your protocol not work. He's gonna like spread too little jam, or he's gonna put the peanut butter on the edge of the bread. He's gonna do everything that you didn't like explicitly say wrong. Yeah. And that's exactly what happens when you're doing like this lab automation work. The scientist, for them, like it's obvious like what protocols should be, and there are steps that they're not gonna explicitly write in the protocol. And the lab automation sometimes like is not very well versed in that typical experiment, doesn't know like the intent of the scientist.
Right.
It knows like to program the robot. And so this miscommunication like leads you to like 2 months, 3 months lead time because you need to go back and forth. The scientist is like, oh, but the robot doesn't do what I want it to do. And you're like, yeah, but you didn't say it this way. So like, can you tell me more? And you do this for like over and over again.
This sounds exactly kind of like a software company have an outsourced software engineering team, right? You know, like, because the context is just not there.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
You know, we make assumptions based off of our knowledge of the work. That context is there. And the big thing with the peanut butter and jelly sandwich, you know, value experiment is that we operate off of implicit instructions. So that in-house software team, you know, has a lot of implicit stuff in their mind, right? But computers demand explicit instructions. That's what programming is for, right? So to make the conversion from implicit, making a peanut butter sandwich, run an RNA extraction, to explicit is really, really tough and requires a lot of feedback loops. It requires a specialist that bottlenecks, you know, the use cases for lab automation pretty severely.
How often do scientists typically run experiments?
I mean, you know, you could talk about a physicist, you could talk about a biologist, you could talk about a chemist, but if you're talking about the life sciences, there is a high volume of experiments run.
So let's say if I run, you know, 4 times a year, would that be a lot or less?
That's not, you wouldn't be in business.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So I have like, so it's in a high number, right?
It's very high number.
It's a daily thing, like a weekly thing. Like our customer down in San Diego, they run these like experiments that we like automated for them like several times a week.
Yeah. Interesting. But each experiment I have to have somebody come over to like tell the robot what to do. And that typically takes 2 months. That's how do they even do any experiments?
That's a great question. They don't use the lab robots to begin with.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because this is the big bottleneck, right? Because this process is so horrible for high differentiation casting, for doing new different experiments. These lab robots, automation is only used where it's high throughput, low differentiation. So that means doing the same thing over and over again, the same exact way, right? So if you're not doing that, you get yourself in the position that you just described. Why would I wait 2 months, pay this specialist if I'm going to be doing all these different experiments, right?
Yep.
Doesn't make sense. So you do it by hand.
So they hire like a lab assistant.
Yeah, they hire lab assistants to do all of this work by hand. And we see that honestly as a waste of you know, some really bright minds.
Yeah, because these scientists for running this experiment by hands could be actually doing the research themselves. Could be actually participate in the research.
Yeah. Instead of just engaging in the physical labor, also engaging in the intellectual labor of the process.
Because these scientists that they hire, they need to have the background, right? They need to have scientific background, technical background in order to run this experiment. So it sounds like you're not, you know, instead of having them to work on really important tasks, you're just doing labor work in the background.
Yes, exactly. Like those are brilliant people. They have like PhDs. They could be reading scientific literature, coming up with new hypotheses, like finding ways of like, you know, curing the disease. But in the end, they're just like spending their time doing labor, like manual work, which is a waste. And that's how we see it.
Are they satisfied with that job? Like if you have a PhD, if I have a PhD, I'm being hired just doing labor work in the lab.
I'll tell you I'm not, and that's the this company. Like I spent time on the bench, and my understanding of innovation in life sciences didn't match the reality, which is why we're doing what we're doing. An example we like to use for people who don't come from science is thinking of going to culinary school, right?
Yep.
People go to culinary school, they research all this complicated stuff with dreams of becoming some chef at a Michelin restaurant, right? What if you do that? What if you go to school, you pay a whole bunch of money, you study very intensely, and you get out of school and your first job is being a line cook, right? You're at Carrabba's or you're at I don't know, Golden Corral being a line cook. You're not gonna be real happy, right?
Yep.
Because what you want to go into cooking for, into food for, is to maybe make new dishes.
Yeah.
Which like make these beautiful renditions of existing dishes, right? Not just do a whole bunch of physical labor. But the job of a line cook and the job of a chef, despite them both cooking, is different. The line cook engages in physical labor, right? They're chopping carrots, they're making soup all day. But the chef is engaging in more intellectual labor. They're tasting something and saying, oh no, this is too salty. Oh no, this kid, use more umami or something, right? Send it back and change it this way. We want people to be chefs instead of line cooks. We want people to be in charge of, you know, intellectual labor and lead the physical labor to automation.
Super cool. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think so much talent, seems like a lot of talent is being now utilizing like in labor that doesn't even require, let's say, a PhD to, you know, to even operate, right? And these minds will like spend so much time acquiring this knowledge, should be working on more important critical pretty good task.
Yeah. And maybe it's just from like the limited customer experience that we've had. Of course, we've done a bunch of customer discovery, and I come from life sciences. But when you see this actually play out, it is unfortunate. Like the first customer that we worked with down in San Diego, they do incredible work making genetic therapies for people with rare diseases. They have a few like super brilliant PhDs that work there to advance this work. But what we see them do a lot, too much, is looking at an Excel file or holding an 8-channel pipette with plates. These are brilliant people, and they're fighting an uphill battle. There's not a lot of money in rare disease. They already are limited in the resources they have. And, we just can't buy into the fact that pipetting is the best use of these brilliant minds for something really important, like creating therapies for genetic diseases.
Yeah. Do these lab assistants, do they churn out quickly? If they're not happy, do they have to, is there a problem with hiring?
No, the market's bad for life science now. It's not favorable for people who are looking to get into it.
So,
it's always a great situation for employers.
Wow. So it sounds like there's not a lot of incentives for the people who in the lab to actually automate this task because they can just hire away.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And it's something non-obvious. It was non-obvious to us to begin with. A lot of people, when they think of automation, they think, oh, well, the driver is to drive the cost down.
Yep.
It's to drive up throughput. But actually, what we find is that it's to achieve reproducibility. We think of softer sciences like psychology or sociology, and we point to some of the landmark experiments and say, those aren't reproducible, right? But we have a horrifying reproducibility crisis in the life sciences ourselves. There are some studies that suggest that up to 70% of published studies are not reproducible in the life sciences.
Really?
Yeah. And there's a whole bunch of different sources of irreproducibility, but you can think of how horrifying it is to base your work off of X paper or X study or whatever project done by your colleague, and then you can't replicate it again. You can't redo it. You can't reproduce the findings. That's really scary, right? And this is can be a death blow to a lot of different research projects and groups. So we spoke to Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, all these different groups, and they told us one of their biggest concerns was reproducibility. You'd have really strict standard operating procedures. You have really strict rules about everything that goes on in the lab. But for some reason, no matter how strict you are, reproducibility issues still crop up. We heard horror stories from Pfizer, instances of magic hands floating around the organization. It might sound weird, but a magic hand or a set of magic hands belong to one person that's able to reproduce an experiment. So if I'm able to do an experiment and nobody else is, then I have magic hands, right? It doesn't make sense. If we have a good protocol, if people are using the same reagents, why can't Teo do the experiment that I can do? It doesn't make sense, especially for both skilled PhD scientists working in one of these companies or something. But it doesn't play out that way. Our reproducibility in the life sciences is a major problem, and automation promises a solution. You can execute these experiments with the mechanical precision that is not possible with human scientists. So it's not about making current science cheaper. It's about enabling a completely different type of science, a more reproducible science.
That's fascinating. So it sounds like the selling point that you're selling to these labs are not the fact that you can replace these lab assistants, right? You can replace the humans. It's more so you can reproduce those experiments. And tell me more about this magic hand thing, because I'm really curious how big of this magic hand problem is. And tell me also, why is there such thing as magic hand? And why can't other people reproduce the experiments?
Right. Great question. Problem is huge. 70% of studies, nothing that ball cat. It's like a huge chunk of our work that may not be reproducible. So it's a very big problem. And second part of your question, how does irreproducibility crop up in life sciences or across any discipline? You have a few different sources. The first is the quality control with reagents. So the different chemicals you're using in experiments, maybe they come from different manufacturers. Maybe some aren't as high in quality as others, right? This can have an impact on reproducibility. And then you go to these sorts of environments that these experiments are executed in. Maybe one lab is a little bit hotter than another lab. Maybe the bench was exposed to sunlight, whereas in another lab it wasn't. We heard one horror story in Vancouver where a PI could not reproduce an experiment for 3 years. It turns out it was because the floors were waxed when it was done, and the floors were not waxed when they tried to reproduce it. So it's really crazy stuff. And then we have what we are trying to help solve, which is converting the intent of the scientist into something non-ambiguous just a set of explicit instructions. This is also where there's potential for a lack of reproducibility. Say we're both scientists at the bench and we got instructions to go mix a chemical before continuing. Maybe we mix it by flicking the tube.Maybe we mix it with a pipette. Maybe we mix it with the machine called vortexer, right? When somebody tells us to mix it, there's ambiguity. And usually we can use context clues to figure out which one of those to do. Maybe there's a sensitive sample and we don't want to shear DNA in the tube, but that's not always really clear. And this ambiguity is what leads people to do different things and what can cause a lack of reproducibility. There's even the physical execution of the experiment. Maybe you use a slightly different technique. You disturb a pellet or something. Physically, the way you perform the experiment might differ from somebody else at the bench and lead to a significantly different yield, purity, or experimental outcomes. So if you have perfect mechanical precision and you have a way to turn implicit scientific intent into a set of non-ambiguous explicit instructions, we're hoping to weed out a lot of the causes of irreproducibility and experimentation.
Every single variable plays a role, right, in the experiment. So you really have to like down to the detail. What did you last use, right, in the experiment to produce this result? Like down to the detail, how many drop? Right, is it machine or is it by hand? Right, is it the floor wax or not wax? Like even that plays a role, right? Like that's really fascinating. What is not heard of outside of the scientific world? Like this magic handling, or is it just me that I don't know about it?
Maybe it'd be better. Coming out of life sciences, did you know about?
I didn't know that the problem was like that big. Honestly, like using my common sense, I feel like I could understand like this like lack of clarity in the protocols. But I would have never guessed it was like that bad.
Wow. And going back to the sort of the machines that they currently use and the technician that they have to hire, I'm curious to know how much are these machines and how much does it cost to hire these people?
That's you're gonna get disturbed by the answer. So the really, really cheap ones are about $25,000.
25,000,
and that goes all the way up. This is gonna be more horrifying, up to like $500,000 for the really large liquid handlers. So the equipment is expensive, but that's not the most expensive part. The most expensive part is the support required to use the equipment. So the total compensation for a lab automation engineer, which is the person who helps you configure and set up these systems, is around $180,000 for Boston and San Francisco. That includes salary, benefits, tax liability for a company. These are expensive people and they're hard to come by because it involves a niche set of skills. This person has to know how to program. They have to have some familiarity with mechanical engineering. They have to have some knowledge in the life sciences. It's a really weird combo. So there's not a lot of these people. There's no place that you can go to school for automation engineering. I think that recently changed. There's one program in like the world where you can go to school to do this, but it's not something you could just like pick up and learn. One of the most popular platforms in their language, Venus, there's a lack of online documentation. You can't just go watch YouTube tutorials on how to do this, right? This is a really, really niche set. There's a lot of people who do it and those people are expensive.
And as soon as they leave the company, then that company gets in trouble. Because imagine you hire. I've actually heard like this story from a friend from MIT who was working at the Koch Institute. She was like, "Oh, we have like these two big robots downstairs, but they haven't been doing anything for 2 months because the one technician that was here, like the lab automation engineer taking care of them, got hired by like the institution next door, and the robot just like down there like collecting dust, So you pay them very, very like an expensive price, and then they just like the utilization is like so low.
It sounds like it's better for this scientist to be the technician than to be the scientist themselves doing the labor work.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go to your solution. Tell me more about what exactly is the solution that you're building and why is it that it's going to change how scientists are going to work?
Sure. So we always like to make the kind of comparison to Waymo. We have a pretty similar starting point. Waymo wanted to make self-driving vehicles and we want to make self-driving lab robots. What do we start with? We start with an unintelligent system that's unable to recognize the world around it and make decisions, right? Waymo starts with a Jaguar, with their white labeling. That Jaguar maybe has some cameras, but it doesn't have LiDAR, right? It can't see or process the world around it. It can't make decisions. What we have is really similar. We have these lab robots that look like 3D printers with a pipette on them that can't understand the world around them or the scientific context that they operate in, right? So what did Waymo do to make their Jaguars self-driving? And what do we have to do to make lab robots self-driving? The first thing which is unfortunate because we're not a hardware company, we're not a lab robotics company, we're not a automation company, is integrate sensors that allow for autonomous operation. So maybe it's something really simple like a time of flight sensor for improved collision detection. Maybe we have done this a camera on the gantry. So there's computer vision integration. You could say, oh, okay, is the correct labware installed? Am I going to grab a tip from the right place? So that's the first step, right? Tools to allow the robot to physically comprehend the world around it. And then there's the real focus of our work, which is on the natural language processing side.
Yep.
We consider this problem of converting scientific intent into executable code to be a natural language processing problem. A subdomain of natural language is executable code, but like with a kind of scientific flavor, right? Like if you had to consider reagent handling instructions and like scientific reasoning in natural language is executable code. So that's where a majority of our work is on the software side, on the natural language processing side. But we do have to integrate some sensors to make these robots walk away autonomous. But yeah, NLP, software side, breaking up all the decisions a lab automation engineer makes into little nodes that we target through different methods to automate. So that way a scientist could communicate with one of these tools as if it were another scientist.
Right. So you're taking this off the shelf lab robot, right? Similar to what Waymo is, partnering Jaguar, right? And you put your own equipment on and you put your own hardware on, like camera, for example, right? What else do you guys put on there?
So we put a camera on there. We put a couple of sensors, like time of flight sensors and one for collision detection. And we want to keep it really minimal. Like again, we don't consider ourselves a hardware company. Yep. We don't consider ourselves a lab robotic company. This is like a necessary evil, right?
So yeah, so you put equipment on it, but the real kind of breakthrough is on the software part.
Absolutely.
Right. So you guys build software where the scientists can interact with the robot directly without the technician. So they don't have to hire this 180K.
Well, right. Maybe they still do have this person, but this automation engineer, one of the quotes that we got for how many systems they can maintain is 3 of these liquid handlers. So 3 boxes, right? So instead of just maintaining 3 boxes and building that system up, which isn't very exciting, maybe this enables an automation engineer to have a huge self-driving lab or really complicated work cells. It also augments the capabilities of their work. So maybe you still do hire an AE, but they get to do more complicated stuff. But yeah, we're mostly focusing on natural language processing software that allows a scientist to communicate with these tools in the way that they do with other scientists. That way you don't need this middleman for high differentiation experimentation.
Super interesting. How would a scientist work with your solution in place?
Sure. So you can imagine our solution in the short term as like a kind of a research assistant for them, right? It's like a co-scientist, a co-pilot for the bench. It sits there and you have some pipetting task that you need to do. Maybe it's something really simple like a seriolution, or maybe it's a qPCR prep or a mini prep, or getting really complicated like a transformation or something, or colony picking, right? You could give this task to this robot, and without having to do all of the setup work of explaining the task in detail, configuring the different liquids that are used, describe the task that you want done as if you had an intern or an RA there and say, hey, intern, I want you to do this task. Understands it at a high level, executes it, and passes it back to you. That way, you're doing less physical labor and more mental labor.
So imagine I'm a scientist. Before that, I have to call, every time I run an experiment, I have to call a technician.
Well, usually you just do it by hand because this isn't even accessible to you. These tools are out of your reach because the technician is going to tell you, what? You want me to spend 2 months of my time setting up this, I think you're only going to run 10 times. Like, go do it by hand. It's quicker, right? That's what happens.
Yep.
So right now, if you're a scientist in R&D or, you're doing anything but like manufacturing, high throughput screening, CLIA, PCRs or something, like you're going to be doing it by hand. So this opens the door. Like you could just abstract this as an RA that's always there, that has really, really fine mechanical precision who you can talk to like a scientist.
And the scientist would just be talking to the robot directly. And so instead of hiring people to do it by hand, instead of calling a technician if it's like a large scale, high volume, which is like mentioned earlier, right? High volume type of experiment. Now they can run this experiment by just talking to the robot directly.
That's correct. And the research assistant who was like holding the pipette is now like thinking about the higher level like experiments, like what do I want to do instead of doing like the more like tedious tasks. And the technician or lab automation that you would hire to like do this liquid handling parameters now is like setting up the entire self-driving lab and like letting like his creativity like loose to like automate much more complex and much more exciting tasks.
Wow. So going back to like the example you mentioned, right? High variety tasks versus high volume, right? So before the lab robot can only do high volume tasks. Because you set up once,
right?
And it just do the same thing over and over and over and over again, right? And when you have changes in the experiment, you have to go reset it, right? But now with your thing that you have built, it sounds like now these scientists can then be able to create multiple variety, right, with different changes, right?
Right. Yeah. Going back to the like line cook example and the current tooling and what we were trying to make, it's like if a chef told all of his line cooks, "Hey, we're getting him a new robotic line cook," right? And he'd be like, "Oh man, that's great. Now we get to spend more time thinking of new dishes and all this stuff," right? But in reality, this robotic line cook can only do one single thing. It can only heat up and serve like Totino's pizza rolls, right? And you're like, I want it to do other things. I want it to make other dishes, right? It can't. It's only gonna make a bajillion Totino's pizza rolls, right? So what you don't have is this flexible substitute to human labor. You just have a manufacturing tool. It's the same thing over and over. But what we're suggesting is like a robotic line cook that understands the context of the cooking. Says, "Oh, you want me to do this? Well, I'm gonna convert that into a set of instructions, execute it, and make a soup that you prefer. You want me to have less salt? I'm gonna make that modification." Instead of a hard-coded tool that just does the same thing over and over again. Because this is not useful to most cooks, right? It's only useful if you're making a bajillion frozen food items that you're gonna go sell at like Food Line or something.
Yeah. Yeah, this sounds like a really good solution, right? Like if it materializes, like what, if you have like a co-pilot for scientists, right? And what were sort of the market insights that led you to this, and how do you know that this is possible?
It's a great
To
question.
even create it, commercialize, and make it even a reality.
Yeah, we can give a brief overview on the amazing fields of AI scientists. It was really a technical unblock that led us to realize that this was possible and there was a great market opportunity. Kay and I met in New York through an incubator called Entrepreneur First. Kay's background in autonomous robotics combined with my background in life sciences quickly led us to realize that we wanted to work on something involving lab automation. But we didn't know what specifically. We didn't know what we were going to do. Maybe make deep hardware, make more complicated workflows. We didn't know until we saw OpenAI's Dev Day last year for ChatGPT 4 Turbo when they were showing off the multimodal features. We were watching it, and I had the idea to take a picture of a jello electrophoresis run. So this is a type of experiment that helps you size DNA, and I wanted to pass it to the model. And I asked it if the bands were in the places that they were supposed to be, and I gave it fake numbers, and if not, what to do. I didn't really expect it to work, but it was able to decipher the image that, yes, these bands are the proper size that you were expecting. The DNA is the proper size, but I didn't even ask it to do this. There's a primer dimer. A primer dimer is an artifact that occurs due to non-specific binding, right? And the model told me that. It said, you have a primer dimer that's due to non-specific binding, and what's causing your non-specific binding is likely like a bad annealing temperature on your experiment. So it was able to perform this like multi-step scientific reasoning. And then when I look at each other, like, holy shit, right? Like these models are, getting in scientific reasoning like at breakneck speeds, right? But they have no physical agency to act like humans, right? So they're developing the mind of scientists, but they have none of the physical agency of a human scientist.
Which is what the lab robot
exactly
do today.
Yeah.
Right?
So without the brain.
Oh, without the brain, right? So we see the brain coming into formation, and we just, cross them over. So we start working on that immediately. And that same exact month, the same time late last year, there were 3 papers that come out that talk about this exact idea. That was co-scientists out of Carnegie Mellon, Kem Karada, EPFL, and RIT, and Organa out of the University of Toronto. Same idea, same core idea in all 3 papers, which is to have language models identically operate lab robotics to do this type of tasking. Same idea. And thus starts the field of AI scientists.
And when you read that paper, how do you feel?
We're like, oh man, we're not the only ones, right? We're not like, other people are having this idea. So like a race starts, right? And we're like, we really were at the right place at the right time. You see a few groups spin out of this. One of the most well-known is called Future House. Eric Schmidt back then gave them tens of millions of dollars to further pursue the development of AI scientists. Another was out of the University of Toronto. The Canadian government issued a $200 million grant to a group called the Acceleration Consortium to build self-driving labs and AI scientists. So like the field really like explodes in November with a few different groups. We start in November, these other groups start in November, and WISE begins to further develop these agentically operated lab robots. You might be like, tempted to ask, well, who cares, right? Who cares if we can make agentically operated lab robots? What does that mean, right? There's an author we like to read a lot. His name is Holden Karnowski. He was previously over at Open Philanthropy, and he has a simple bot experiment called the duplicator. He talks a lot about like alignment and AI safety stuff. and like business as usual and the end of business as usual. But in this simple thought experiment, he asks readers to imagine a magical cardboard box called the duplicator. And this cardboard box is capable of taking one person in and spitting two of the same person out. So Karnofsky asks readers, what is the highest impact use case that we can think of for this box?
You would just duplicate the smartest people you can find, the Einstein of the world, right?
You would be able to duplicate a bunch of these people, and these people would go on and invent new things. They would come up with breakthroughs across a whole bunch of different disciplines, right? But what if we did actually have this like runaway development of technical talent? Karnofsky says that it will lead to like the runaway development of different innovations, right? Which makes sense. If we have a whole bunch of people who are responsible for innovation and we can mass manufacture them, then we mass manufacture innovation, right?
Yep.
And he, like, you know, we're both inclined to agree with them. Writes some pretty crazy stuff, like that this event will trigger a period of hyperbolic growth, right?
Yep.
It just goes because if we have a runaway amount of scientists and engineers, and it's runaway science and engineering, right?
Yep.
And we see a rate of innovation that has been unprecedented in human history. But the duplicator doesn't exist. It's just a cardboard box. It's from a comic series, Calvin Hobbes, right?
Yeah. Which led to my next question, actually. How long of a future is that? First question would be, how long of a future would an AI co-pilot scientist exist?
Right.
And second question is, how long of a future a duplicator like this exists for all kinds of jobs?
Right. That's a great question. I think we could speak a little bit more accurately to the sciences instead of general labor. But this duplicator doesn't exist right now until AI scientists emerge. And that's why people are really excited about it, right? Because an AI scientist is functionally a duplicator. What we were trying to do is make this entity that's capable of automating the scientific method, right? Our focus is on the experimentation part of the stack. So scientific method. You come up with a hypothesis, you come up with an experiment to test that hypothesis, you conduct the experiment, and then you evaluate the data that comes out of the experiment to see if your hypothesis was correct or not. If it's not, you iterate on the model responsible for that hypothesis, right? So that's the scientific method.
Okay.
An AI scientist is an entity that's capable of doing this process, the scientific method, and we're at the execution part, actually doing the physical experimentation, right? So if you were able to make a whole bunch of entities capable of
producing scientific methods?
Yeah, of going through the scientific method, it's the same as mass producing engineers and scientists, right? So like an AI scientist is a duplicator. It will trigger this period of like hyperbolic growth. That's why people are really interested. How long will it take for the duplicator, a super robust AI scientist, to emerge? We don't know, but there's some good estimates. There was another person from OpenFindB, Alia Kotra, who wrote a report back in, I think, 2021 that explores the possibility of the emergence of what she considers to be a transformative AI model that's capable of doing this task. And I think it was a 50% probability that she gauged the emergence of such a model appearing by 2050.
2050.
Yeah. So 50% chance that something like this comes out before 2050. So we exist at one part on that tech, right? We're execution. We're physically doing the experiments.
Yep.
But there are parts upstream and downstream from us. We consider future house to be upstream from us because they want to develop models that are capable of coming up with novel hypotheses, right? And then they want to come up with models that are capable of knowledge distillation, which means looking at data that comes out of experiments and noting patterns and trends and saying, oh, well, had you considered like this hypothesis? So that's further upstream and downstream.
Yep.
But we really want to focus on the physical execution because if this isn't solved, then it becomes a bottleneck.
Yep.
Maybe we have models like AlphaFold 3 or other generative AI models that are able to do really, really great things like predict protein folding or whatever else. But that doesn't matter if we don't have the labor to actually take that further downstream, right? There still is a step where you have to synthesize the protein. There is still a step where you have to do the physical experimentation. Biology will not be solved in silico anytime soon. Training a foundation model for biology requires a lot of high reproducibility data, a volume of data that we do not currently have access to, and a level of reproducibility that we currently can't achieve. So for the foreseeable future, biology won't be solved in silico, which necessitates physical experimentation. And if we want to automate the scientific method, it requires creating agents like we're talking about and we're working at Testuwan to do this physical experimentation.
That's really fascinating. I think you brought a really good point, which is foundation model can predict like protein, protein folder, right? And all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, you need data, right? And you need people doing the experiments. right, in order for the experiments to come to fruition, right? And it sounds like you guys have this also creating a data foundry. Am I correct? Like a data foundry asset for these models to do even better reasoning.
It may be a later focus of ours, but right now our focus is on solving the issues that prohibit the mass collection of this data and the mass use of automation tools to collect high reproducibility data. Once we crack that, then it opens the door to having a data foundry because we own the platform that enables high reproducibility, high differentiation, experimentation. But to get to that point, where we're able to develop a platform capable of collecting all that data trained foundation models, we have to solve the communication problem. So we see this as a technical unblock to really, really exciting things, like collecting the data necessary for foundation models.
Yeah, and that's insane. That's insane. I think what you guys are doing here can unblock so many things. Because like you mentioned earlier, if you unblock the physical stuff, the physical labor, going through the scientific methods, like you say, right, then it opens up the potential for so many breakthroughs that could happen, right? Because you have the scientific method being automated that has a second order effect, right? Which is more data being produced, right? More data being produced is gonna make better models, right? And so on and so on. So it's multiple order effect of the work that you guys are doing. Am I correct?
We're pretty excited about it.
This is super exciting. And then going back to where you are today, right? What are some of the biggest challenges that you are facing in order to make that happen? Is it on the technical front, right? Is it on getting people to adopt this? Like, what is it right now?
I mean, we've already touched a lot on the PBJ sandwich example of trying to really understand the scientific intent. We are trying to translate scientific intent into something that's executable for the robot. And one of the major issue here is the way that scientists explicit the protocol and all the steps that are supposed to happen in the assay that they're running. And this is something that couldn't be done before natural language processing came out. But this is really something we're going to spend a lot of time and effort trying to make the system much more robust, so that the AI agents would be able to catch if something in the protocol is wrong. The scientist would make an ambiguous protocol, and the level to machine engineer at the moment would catch that and go ask as a normal human, what did you mean this or that? And having this agent capable of doing this is challenging, but very exciting.
In the number of implicit steps, I think, like Tara was saying, it's our really big challenge right now, documenting each one of these and coming up with the systems to solve for it. It's ridiculous. The number of abstractions that scientists rely on, implicit steps, you wouldn't imagine it. We went down to San Diego for our first deployment, and we had the pipette tip sit in a specific buffer for a little bit. And it came back up and caused an error. And the entire experiment stopped. And we looked at the pipette, and you could see that there's crystals forming on the pipette tip, right? That buffer was prone to crystallization, and it blocked the channel. We couldn't have possibly known that, right? It wasn't noted in the protocol. It wasn't noted anywhere. But scientists do know that, don't leave the pipette tip in this specific buffer for a long time because it might crystallize. But how do we translate that really, really implicit stuff into a explicit set of steps and behaviors? Tough. And we're going to constantly realize this high degree of implicity, and we have to come up with a whole bunch of rules and approaches to solve for it. It's a tough problem, but it's exciting.
If you were to do that rule-based, that would be just impossible. AI agent is enable that, which is super exciting.
This sounds like you're going to face a lot of what the autonomous driving research for the past 10 to 15 years face, which is, the reason why autonomous cars is only commercializing today is because there's so many, edge cases and corner cases, a lot of scenarios that is hard to predict, right? On everyday road, that these autonomous cars are not trained to do, right? And that leads to them not being able to have, a truly safe autonomous driving. And that's why, even though, right, autonomous cars are able to, drive safely 99% of the time, but that 1% is preventing them from commercializing at scale. And that is the reason why, all, companies like Waymo, Cruise, they're collecting data, they're putting HD maps, right, over and over again, just so that they could get that 1%, those edge cases, collect as much edge case scenario as possible. And I feel like you guys are gonna face the same problem as well, right? To automate all of this experiments, sure, you can get it to 90%, 95%, 99%, but there's always this edge cases that you have to They have to sort, and that might prevent you from like going to market. How do you see that?
Yeah, you're correct. And in the case of like self-driving cars, if you have an AI agent that like hallucinates 1% of the time and decides to take a left instead of taking a right, the consequences are going to be terrible. That is not the case in our setup, where anyway the scientists wouldn't trust like a black box. They have like very much like the intention to know everything that is happening like inside the robot. They wouldn't trust it otherwise. They are scientists. They want to know exactly what's happening in their experiments. And so we would never one-shot the protocol and just like make the robot execute everything without having the scientific person checking, the protocol that's been generated. There will be always a sanity check step at one point, because the scientists, like want to control everything. So even if we hallucinate 1% of the time, we'll always have the scientists like checking. And even if like tomorrow like LLMs are solved and they never hallucinate, like this like magic world where like LLMs never hallucinate, we would still have that step because we want to like earn the trust of the scientists.
Absolutely. This process of converting scientific intent to executable code, like Teo says, isn't one shot linear. It's based off of a series, just like it is today, of these design, build, and test loops that chain together. But what we're doing is creating an AI agent that's capable of going back and forth with the scientist to go through these different loops, so that there's transparency. If there is an edge case, a human can see it, and it still streamlines their ability to use these tools. It's like having a hesitant intern at the bench. He says, like, boss, well, what do I do about this? I'm not sure about this. Can you tell me? Can you clarify? So you could just really imagine like a hesitant intern who asks you questions to make sure that they're doing the right thing.
Okay, that makes sense. So instead of being fully autonomous, your solution is more human in the loop, right? And because scientists, they also prefer, like you say, they also prefer to be working hand in hand with the robot. And that's why the solution, unlike autonomous car, right? It's fully autonomous. If you do something wrong, it's going to cost life, right? For you guys, that's not too big of a worry. And that allows you to commercialize and go to market a lot faster.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Interesting. So that leads to my last question. For other founders working in the biohealthcare robotic space who aspire to start, a company similar to yours or company in your space, what should they be looking? Where are the opportunities? What are the gaps in the market you think has a lot of potential?
Did you come up with one, or am I gonna?
No, you can take it.
All right. I don't know how happy our investors are going to be with this answer, but this is the greatest opportunity, and will be one of the most consequential developments in like our technical history. Like, if we can achieve what Karnofsky describes as a duplicator, everything changes. Cancer research changes. All right, genetic therapy research changes. Life extension research changes. Like everything in the life sciences. And once we, are able to translate this set of ideas to different disciplines like materials or chemical engineering, those all change too. Like, this is a catalyst to an unforeseen rate of innovation. Like, this is like the biggest opportunity of our generation. This is the most consequential, like technical challenge of our time. If we can achieve a duplicator, everything else changes. And the path to a duplicator has emerged. So to anybody who's interested in like robotics or life sciences or healthcare or anything else, if you're asking for the greatest opportunity, it's this one. If you're asking what to do, honestly, probably do what we do, because we're confident enough that we are in the right direction. Maybe we have some things wrong today. We'll have some things wrong tomorrow, but we're going to keep digging, keep digging, keep digging. So come work on this. Come work on AI scientists.
Wow, that's super fascinating. Yeah, if you can duplicating, like very sought after labor, right, will be the biggest unlock for humanity's progress. Cool, man. Thanks for coming to the podcast.
Thanks.